His name was Thomas, or perhaps William. Perhaps it was a name that no chronicler ever thought to write down. One of the thousands of ordinary men swept up into an extraordinary storm. He was a soldier from the English countryside, a man who had never seen the sea before the year 1191, who had never felt the weight of a coat of mail in the blistering, merciless heat of a Middle Eastern summer. He stands on a narrow strip of beach at a place called Jaffa, a coastal city on the edge of what men in his time called the Holy Land. It is the year 1192 AD. The sun is already a hammer blow at barely mid-morning. His shield arm burns. His sword hand is slick. He has not eaten since yesterday. He cannot remember the last time he was not afraid. And then he hears it. Richard, the King of England. The man his enemies called Malik Rik, King Richard. The man history would call the Lionheart. And what he does next will be remembered for 8 centuries. To understand the Third Crusade, we have to first understand the world that created it. And that world is, to put it plainly, not one that modern people find immediately legible. It is a world in which geography and theology are one and the same thing, in which a piece of land is not simply real estate. It is the center of the universe, Jerusalem. To the Christians of medieval Europe, this city was not merely important, it was the axis around which all of human history turned. It was where Jesus Christ had been crucified, buried, and, in the belief of every Christian from a peasant farmer in Normandy to the Pope sitting in Rome, resurrected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over what tradition held to be the site of both the crucifixion and the tomb, was the most sacred piece of ground on earth. To die defending it was, in the theology of the era, to earn a direct passage to paradise. To lose it was to suffer an almost incomprehensible spiritual catastrophe. But Jerusalem was not only sacred to Christians. For Jews, it was the site of the Temple of Solomon, the house of God, destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, but spiritually present in ways that transcended the physical. For Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the holy, the third most sacred city in all of Islam, the site from which the Prophet Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven on a miraculous night journey. The Dome of the Rock, built in the late 7th century over the rock from which that ascension occurred, was and remains one of the most magnificent buildings in the world. 3 faiths, 1 city, an arrangement that has never been simple, and that in the year 1187 AD was about to become catastrophically, violently complicated once again. The story of the Third Crusade doesn't begin in 1189, when the armies of Europe finally set out. It begins nearly a century earlier, in 1095, when Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd at Clermont in France and made one of the most consequential speeches in human history. Urban's message was simple, electric, and devastating in its implications. The holy city of Jerusalem, held by Muslims since the 7th century, must be retaken. Christians who took up arms for this cause would receive a plenary indulgence, full remission of the temporal punishment for their sins. It was, in the theological language of the age, a free pass to heaven in exchange for military service. The response was beyond anything Urban had anticipated. Tens of thousands of people, knights, peasants, priests, women, children, began moving east. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was a ragged, brutal, often chaotic mass migration that somehow, against almost all rational military expectation, succeeded. In 1099, a Crusader army stormed Jerusalem. The slaughter that followed was appalling by any standard. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city were massacred in enormous numbers. But the Christians held the city. For the next 88 years, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Crusader state carved out of the Middle East, existed in a state of permanent, exhausting tension. It was a small Christian kingdom surrounded by Muslim neighbors, held together by military skill, political maneuvering, and the steady trickle of new recruits and pilgrims from Europe. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, emerged in this period as professional warrior monks who formed the backbone of the kingdom's defense. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, was a disaster. Conceived by the brilliant and formidable Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, led by the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, it achieved virtually nothing. and ended in humiliation, but its failure planted seeds. The Islamic world, so fragmented and internally divided for decades, was beginning to consolidate. A new kind of leader was emerging, one who understood that the Crusader states could be defeated if the Muslim powers stopped fighting each other and started fighting them. His full name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. We know him as Saladin. And to understand why the Third Crusade happened, you need to understand this man, because without him, there would have been nothing to crusade about. Born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq, Saladin was a Kurd, not an Arab. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a military administrator under the Turkish Zengi dynasty. And young Saladin grew up in a world of courts and campaigns, of political intrigue and military calculation. He was educated, religiously devout in the Sunni tradition, and possessed of a quality that the medieval chronicles, both Islamic and Christian, consistently remark upon. He was genuinely, unusually just. This isn't hagiography. The Christian sources, his enemies, repeatedly note that Saladin kept his word, treated prisoners with relative humanity, and was capable of extraordinary generosity. When he conquered Jerusalem in 1187, he famously refused to allow the massacre that the Christian conquest of 1099 had produced. He ransomed the poor, freed many who could not pay, and allowed the Christian inhabitants to leave in safety. This was not weakness. It was deliberate, sophisticated statecraft, the act of a leader who understood that how you win matters as much as whether you win. But how did Saladin get to the point of conquering Jerusalem? The answer is a two-decade story of political genius. Starting in the 1160s, Saladin rose through the ranks of the Egyptian Fatimid Caliphate, ironically, a Shia caliphate that he served as vizier despite being Sunni. When the last Fatimid caliph died in 1171, Saladin smoothly transitioned Egypt back to Sunni Islam and loyalty to the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad. He had become, in effect, the ruler of Egypt. Through a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, diplomatic pressure, and the occasional assassination, Saladin spent the 1170s and early 1180s unifying the fractious Muslim world around a single cause, jihad against the Crusader states. He was careful and patient. He fought when he had to and negotiated when he could. He built coalitions. He waited for the Crusaders to make mistakes. They obliged him. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was a kingdom eating itself, a place of extraordinary political dysfunction. It was riven by factional conflicts between old noble families, military orders, and recent arrivals from Europe. The royal family was embroiled in succession crises with lethal consequences. Baldwin IV, a young man of extraordinary courage and political ability, was also a leper. His disease slowly consumed him, and court factions circled his throne like sharks. Baldwin held things together, even defeating Saladin at Montgisard in 1177. But Baldwin was dying, and the factions were already positioning for the succession. After his death in 1185, the throne passed to Guy of Lusignan, a French noble. Guy was not up to the job. He was weak, susceptible to influence, and lacked decisive judgment. The most catastrophic personality in Guy's orbit was Reynald of Châtillon. A French adventurer of ferocious energy and zero moral restraint, he had spent years as a prisoner. He raided Muslim caravans in violation of truces and launched an unauthorized naval raid on the Red Sea. In 1187, he attacked a large Muslim caravan traveling under a truce, killing hundreds. Saladin demanded restitution. Reynald refused. Guy of Lusignan proved unable to force compliance. Saladin, patient for over a decade, declared the truce broken. He called a jihad. He called up every ally, every vassal, every soldier he could muster, and he marched. July 4th, 1187. The fate of the Crusader kingdoms was decided. Saladin besieged Tiberias, knowing the Crusader army would have to respond. The High Court of Jerusalem met in emergency session at Acre. The debate was fierce. Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, argued passionately against marching across the dry plateau. He knew what the dry plateau could do to an army, even willing to sacrifice his own city. Reynald of Châtillon argued the opposite. To sit and do nothing was cowardice. God would provide. The kingdom's honor demanded action. March. Guy first agreed with Raymond, but during the night he changed his mind. Reynald's faction swayed him, suggesting refusal to fight was cowardice. The army would march. Saladin must have smiled. He had set the trap. The Crusaders walked into it. The largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever put in the field marched towards Tiberias. Saladin had an army of perhaps 12,000 cavalry and a much larger infantry force. Numbers were not his decisive advantage. Geography and logistics were. Saladin's cavalry harassed them constantly, stinging, probing, exhausting men and horses. By day's end, the army had not reached water. They camped on dry ground, desperately thirsty. The wells they hoped to reach were controlled by Saladin. His men lit the scrub around the camp. By morning, the army was barely functional. The infantry, tormented by thirst, began to break. Guy of Lusignan tried desperately to reform his army on the high ground near the horns of Hattin. He failed. Saladin's cavalry swept around both flanks. The infantry were massacred. The knights fought on, repeatedly charging Saladin's lines, repeatedly driven back. When Guy of Lusignan was taken prisoner, Saladin wept with gratitude and religious ecstasy. The true cross was captured. Reynald of Châtillon was personally executed by Saladin. The flower of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military was either dead or in chains. The kingdom was naked. In the 3 months after Hattin, Saladin took virtually everything. 52 cities and castles fell. On October 2nd, 1187, less than 3 months after the disaster, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The Christian world received the news like a physical blow. Pope Gregory VIII issued a Crusade bull, Audita Tremendi, with unusual speed. The loss of Jerusalem, Gregory argued, was God's punishment for the sins of Christians. The only response was penance, reform, and war. The response across Europe was the largest collective mobilization of military force since the First Crusade. 3 of the most powerful rulers in the Western world took the cross. Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor, called Barbarossa, was perhaps the single most formidable ruler in Europe. He was in his late 60s, had been emperor for over 30 years, and was respected and feared across the continent. His army was the largest crusader force ever assembled, by some estimates 100,000 men. Philip II of France, called Philip Augustus, was a young king, brilliant but cold and calculating. Philip was motivated as much by politics as piety, seeking to enhance his prestige and neutralize domestic enemies. This also gave him leverage over his great rival, Richard I of England, called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. Duke of Aquitaine and Normandy, Count of Maine and Anjou, Lord of Ireland, and from July 1189, King of England. Richard was 31 years old when he took the cross, a truly remarkable human being. He was physically imposing, over 6 feet tall, athletic, and trained from childhood in military arts. He was a poet and musician of genuine ability, speaking Occitan, French, and Latin. He had been fighting and winning battles since his mid-teens, demonstrating strategic intelligence. He was absolutely uncompromisingly, ferociously committed to the Third Crusade as a personal mission. The reconquest of Jerusalem was a cause he would spend treasure, health, relationships, and nearly his life pursuing. If you had to choose one leader to follow into the Third Crusade, who would you pick and why? Before we follow these 3 kings to Jerusalem, we need to answer a question any competent military analyst would ask. How do you get an army of tens of thousands of men from Europe to the Middle East in the 12th century? The answer is more complicated and more consequential than it might appear. In 1189, there were 2 ways to move a large army from Western Europe to the Holy Land. You could go by land, overland through the Balkans and Anatolia, following the First Crusade's route. Or you could go by sea, crossing the Mediterranean directly to the Levantine coast. Each route had profound advantages and disadvantages, and the choices made would shape the entire campaign. The overland route had historical precedent, chosen by Frederick Barbarossa and his enormous German army. Advantages were real. A land army could forage and requisition food as it marched. It could move without worrying about weather, seasonal sailing windows, or the enormous cost of chartering ships. Frederick's army was simply too large. No 12th century fleet could have carried 100,000 men across the Mediterranean. But the overland route had problems that should have been anticipated from Crusade's history. The Byzantine Empire, nominally an ally, had grown increasingly hostile to Western armies. The relationship between the Germans and Byzantines quickly became toxic. Frederick's army spent months crossing the Balkans in something between an allied march and an armed occupation. They had to fight their way through Bulgaria and Thrace. Relations with Isaac Angelus deteriorated to the point where Frederick briefly captured Adrianople. He even threatened to storm Constantinople itself. Isaac eventually capitulated, but the delays were costly. The army lost the campaign season of 1189. When the Germans finally crossed into Anatolia, the heartland of the Turkish Seljuk Sultanate, the hard fighting truly began. The Turks employed the same strategy: constant harassment, picking off stragglers, hitting supply convoys. They denied foraging and refused to offer pitched battle where heavy German cavalry could be decisive. The army took Konya, the Seljuk capital, in May 1190, a significant military achievement. And then, just as the hardest stretch of the journey lay ahead, the unthinkable happened. On June 10, 1190, Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, drowned in the Salif River. The exact circumstances are disputed by chronicles. Some say his horse was swept away. Some say he tried to swim across. One account suggests he fell from his horse on a bridge. The one thing all accounts agree on is the result. Frederick I did not survive the crossing. The effect on his army was catastrophic. The German army simply fell apart. Some soldiers tried to preserve the emperor's body in vinegar, but the process failed in the heat. The body was eventually buried at Antioch. Without their leader, thousands simply turned around and marched back to Europe. Of the enormous army that set out, perhaps 5,000 men ever reached the Crusader camp at Acre. The Third Crusade had lost its greatest military asset before a single battle against Saladin. While Frederick Barbarossa was marching, the kings of France and England took a different approach. They were going by sea, but not together and not as friends. Philip Augustus of France and Richard of England were, to put it mildly, complicated. They had grown up in overlapping courts, allies, rivals, and everything between. Richard had spent years preparing for the Crusade, with a ferocity that bordered on obsessive. He raised money in ways that alarmed his barons. He sold offices, privileges, titles, land, and castles. He reportedly said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. His contemporaries thought he was reckless. He wasn't. He was conducting a ruthless financial mobilization. He understood that the one thing that would determine success or failure was resources. By the summer of 1190, Richard had assembled one of the best-equipped Crusader forces. He had a purpose-built navy of over 100 ships to carry his army, supplies, horses, and siege equipment. The sea route was more expensive and logistically complex than land, but it offered enormous advantage. That advantage was supply security. An army on the sea route carried its supplies with it. It didn't depend on hostile rulers for foraging. It could be resupplied from Cyprus, Sicily, or any coastal port. As long as the fleet stayed together, the army was fed. The contrast with the German approach is instructive. Frederick Barbarossa's vast land army was dependent on local resources. Every mile of hostile terrain was a logistics crisis, consuming men and materiel at a high rate. Richard's sea route, despite storms and costs, offered a sound strategic logic. A well-supplied army would outperform a large, hungry one. Philip Augustus of France took a similar sea route, but with less elaborate preparation, reflecting his cautious nature. He arrived at Acre with a capable army, but Richard brought the siege equipment, supplies, and strategic vision. In spring 1191, Richard's fleet moved through the Mediterranean when a storm scattered several of his ships. Among the vessels driven off course were ships carrying Joanna, Richard's sister, and Berengaria of Navarre, his queen-to-be. These ships took refuge off Cyprus, then ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a ruthless Byzantine prince. Isaac refused aid, seized shipwrecked crusaders, and tried to lure Joanna and Berengaria ashore. He treated a crusader messenger with contempt, a serious miscalculation from his perspective. When Richard arrived and learned what happened, he did what he always did. He attacked it. In barely 3 weeks, Richard's forces landed on Cyprus, defeated Isaac's army, captured him, and added the island to his domain. The strategic significance was immense. Cyprus became the primary supply and logistics base for the Crusader operation. It was a fertile, Christian-controlled island within easy sailing distance of the Levantine coast. Richard turned maritime bad luck into one of the most consequential strategic gains of the entire crusade. He also married Berengaria in Cyprus, completing an engagement arranged years before. The wedding was brief, the honeymoon non-existent. Richard had a crusade to run. The siege of Acre was already in progress when Richard arrived in June 1191, ongoing for almost 2 years. 23 months of siege, with a Crusader army slowly strangling the city, while Saladin's army strangled the Crusaders. The siege was initiated by Guy of Lusignan, who, after Hattin, marched to Acre and began besieging it. Saladin arrived with a relief army, creating a three-way standoff: Crusaders besieging Acre, Saladin besieging the Crusaders. Over 2 years, tens of thousands of Crusaders arrived, and tens of thousands died, not in battle, but from disease. The camp was a pestilential hell. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases swept through the ranks with horrifying efficiency. Chroniclers describe mountains of bodies, mass graves, and the sick caring for the sicker. The political situation was also a mess, with 2 claimants to the throne, Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat. These 2 men despised each other, their factions arguing for 2 years about who was rightfully king. Into this troubled camp, in June 1191, came Richard of England. Philip Augustus had arrived first, in April 1191, trying to get the siege moving with engineers and siege engines. He was a competent besieger, but the walls of Acre held firm. When Richard arrived on June 8, 1191, the atmosphere changed with remarkable speed. His fame preceded him, and his arrival was received almost like the arrival of a messiah by the exhausted camp. Richard brought more siege engines, supplies, and tactical energy than anyone had seen in 2 years. He was also sick, contracting Arnaldia, a fever-based illness, and was bedridden for days. Yet the siege advanced. He had his bed carried to the front lines, directing placement of siege engines from a litter. His siege engines, including Evil Neighbor, hammered at the walls with devastating effect. His crossbowmen maintained relentless pressure, and his organizational ability imposed discipline on the chaotic operation. Saladin watched from the hills, sending relief attempts, but his troops were unable to break through. The defenders of Acre were in desperate straits, their supplies critically low after 2 years. They tried to coordinate with Saladin via carrier pigeon and swimmers, but he couldn't break through. On July 12, 1191, 34 months after the siege began, Acre surrendered. The terms: 3,000 garrison soldiers and non-combatants as hostages, the True Cross, and 200,000 gold dinars. In exchange for their lives and the release of Christian prisoners, Saladin had 40 days to fulfill these conditions. What happened next is one of the most controversial episodes of the entire crusade. The negotiations over the terms of surrender dragged on. Saladin struggled to gather the required ransom. The timing of prisoner exchanges was disputed. One side accused the other of delay and bad faith. Communication failures and possibly deliberate stalling tactics were evident. On August 20, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of the Acre garrison. Approximately 2,700 prisoners were killed. Men, women, and children. The massacre was carried out with methodical efficiency. Let us be honest, it was an atrocity. No modern framework makes mass execution of bound prisoners anything other than a war crime. To understand it in context, we need to think about what Richard was facing. He needed to march his army south to Jaffa, then Jerusalem. The march along the coast was the most dangerous military movement of the Crusade, under constant attack from Saladin's forces. He had 3,000 prisoners who required guards, food, and logistics. Resources desperately needed for the march. The 40-day deadline had passed. The cold military logic was that the prisoners were an operational liability. Saladin had failed to fulfill the terms in time. Richard made the decision to kill them. Saladin's response was rage and grief. The massacre cast a long shadow over the moral character of the Third Crusade and Richard's reputation. He was capable of generosity and chivalry, demonstrating this repeatedly. He was also capable of this. Both things are true. The army marched the next day. Richard's strategic objective was Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an inland city, so an army needs a coastal base for supplies. The plan was to march from Acre to Jaffa. Simple to state, nightmarish to execute. Saladin had no intention of allowing Richard to march unmolested. Saladin's strategy was clear: destroy or cripple Richard's army before it reached Jaffa. He would use constant harassment, hit the flanks and rear, pick off stragglers, create disorder and fatigue. When the army broke, strike hard with cavalry. Richard understood Saladin's strategy perfectly. He designed his march order specifically to defeat it. What Richard constructed was one of the most sophisticated march formations in medieval military history. Every element designed to absorb punishment. The army marched in a column, with the Mediterranean Sea on its left flank. Richard's fleet sailed alongside, maintaining pace. This was logistical genius. Supplies, ammunition, fresh men available at any point, transferred by small boats from ship to shore. Saladin could not cut Richard's supply line because it was on the water. On the army's right flank, where Saladin's attacks would come, Richard placed his infantry. Not a thin screen, but a thick, disciplined formation. Their job was to absorb the arrow storm and hold the line against cavalry charges. They were not to pursue, not to break formation. Behind the infantry shield wall, in the protected interior, marched the cavalry, the army's decisive striking force. Richard intended to keep them fresh, protected from arrows, ready to counterattack at the right moment. The temptation for knights would be overwhelming. Saladin's men would taunt them, make provocative gestures. Richard's standing orders were iron. No one charges without a signal. No one breaks formation. No one. The rear guard was given to the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, the most disciplined soldiers, men for whom obedience was a monastic vow, with professional pride to hold formation under extreme pressure. The rear guard would bear the heaviest pressure, as Saladin's cavalry consistently tried to press hardest from behind. The march protocol was almost monastic in its rigidity. The army moved in the morning and halted in the early afternoon. They marched in silence or with drums and trumpets for coordination. When it halted completely, as a unit. Men were struck by so many arrows, they looked like hedgehogs, and kept walking. The march from Acre to Jaffa lasted from August 22nd to September 10th, 1191, 19 days. On virtually every one of those days, Saladin's forces attacked. The pressure was constant and cumulative. The horse archers used the Parthian shot. They would ride toward the formation, fire arrows, then wheel away. They did this continuously, for hours, wearing down horses and men. The arrows caused casualties, frightened horses, exhausted men. Richard's response was his own ranged weapon, the crossbow. Crusader crossbowmen could outrange most light bows. They could penetrate the lighter armor of Arabic and Turkish cavalry. Richard maintained a rotating cycle of crossbowmen. The heat was ferocious. Men in full mail were being cooked. Water from the fleet was essential. The most serious crisis occurred near Caesarea. The Hospitaller rearguard came under the heaviest attack. Saladin threw his cavalry against them, trying to roll it up, to cause it to break, to trigger panic. The Hospitaller master, Garnier de Nablus, sent messages to Richard begging permission to charge. Richard refused. Hold formation. The pressure on the Hospitallers reached a point their discipline could barely contain. Two knights finally broke formation. Richard, to his credit, recognized what was happening and made an instant decision. He ordered the full army to charge. The whole formation pivoted. Cavalry poured through gaps in the infantry screen. A catastrophic failure transformed into a counterattack. The Muslim cavalry, pressing hard, suddenly found Richard's knights coming at them from the front. The shock broke their formations. Saladin's men fell back. This episode near Caesarea was a tactical victory, but also a lesson. Richard could not maintain the march formation indefinitely under this kind of pressure. Saladin would find the right moment and the right place for his decisive attack, and both commanders knew it. We're about to enter the most intense military engagements of the entire campaign, culminating in a battle that military historians still study today. Before we reach the climactic battle at Jaffa, let us briefly survey the 5 most significant military engagements of the Third Crusade. Battle Nadra 1, the Battle of Hattin, July 4, 1187. Technically before the Third Crusade, Hattin was its primary cause. Crusader forces, approximately 1,200 knights, 18,000 infantry. Overall command, Guy of Lusignan. Saladin's forces, approximately 12,000 cavalry and 18,000 plus infantry. Overall command, Saladin. Outcome, total Crusader defeat. The majority of the Crusader army killed or captured, the True Cross taken, Guy of Lusignan and most of the kingdom's military leadership captured. The Kingdom of Jerusalem effectively destroyed as a military force. Long-term significance, the trigger for the Third Crusade. Without Hattin, there is no Third Crusade. Battle number 2, the Fall of Acre, 1189-1191. The Siege of Acre was less a single battle than a 23-month operation. But in terms of strategic significance, it ranks among the most important engagements of the Crusade. Crusader forces at the siege, varying but at its maximum perhaps 30,000, 50,000 men, drawn from France, England, Germany, Italy, Flanders, and the surviving Crusader states. Key commanders, initially Guy of Lusignan, then joined by Philip Augustus of France and Richard the First of England. Saladin's forces, the garrison of Acre plus Saladin's relief army on the hills around the siege camp. Outcome, Crusader victory. Acre taken on July 12, 1191. The city would serve as the Crusaders' main base for the rest of the campaign. Casualties were catastrophic on both sides. Tens of thousands of Crusaders died at Acre, the vast majority from disease rather than combat. Turning point, Acre's fall re-established the Crusaders as a viable military force in the Holy Land and gave Richard a secure base for operations. Battle number 3, the Battle of Arsuf, September 7, 1191. Arsuf was the pitched battle that Saladin had been trying to provoke. It represents both Richard's greatest pre-Jaffa tactical achievement and a critical strategic inflection point. Crusader forces, approximately 10,000, 15,000 men. Key commanders, Richard the First of England, the Hospitallers on the rearguard, the Templars on the vanguard. Saladin's forces, estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000 men. Saladin himself in command, with his emirs leading various divisions. The battle began as the army was passing through the plain near the town of Arsuf. Saladin threw everything he had at the Crusader column. The attack was ferocious. The rearguard, the Hospitallers, took devastating casualties. Richard's orders remained the same. Hold formation. Do not charge. Wait for the signal. The Hospitallers could not hold much longer. The master of the hospital, in desperation, sent a final message to Richard. "We are losing our horses. We cannot hold." Richard gave them a few more minutes. Then, at exactly the right psychological moment, Richard sounded the charge. The impact was shattering. The Muslim cavalry, pressed hard against the Crusader infantry, had little room to maneuver when the knights came at them. The shock broke the Muslim formations. Saladin's men fell back with serious casualties. Richard followed up with discipline, halting the charge before it carried his cavalry too far from the infantry support, reforming and attacking again. 3 separate charges broke 3 separate Muslim defensive positions. Outcome, decisive Crusader tactical victory. Saladin's army suffered significant casualties and was forced to withdraw. Significance: Arsuf demonstrated that Saladin's harassment strategy could not stop a well-disciplined Crusader army, and that when forced to fight on Richard's terms, his cavalry could not withstand the shock of a coordinated charge. It was a profound psychological blow to Saladin's forces. Battle number 4, the Battle for Jaffa, 1192, first and second actions. We will cover this in the detail it deserves in the next section. But note its position. It is both the fourth and, in some sense, the fifth most important battle of the campaign. Because what historians call the Battle of Jaffa was actually two separate engagements: Saladin's capture of the city and Richard's dramatic recapture of it. Together, they represent the military climax of the Third Crusade. Battle number 5, the Twin Siege Campaigns of Jerusalem, 1191-1192. Not a single battle, but a campaign that produced no climactic engagement, which is itself one of the most significant facts of the Third Crusade. Twice, Richard's army advanced to within striking distance of Jerusalem, and twice it turned back. The first advance, in the winter of 1191-1192, brought the army within 12 miles of Jerusalem. Scouts could reportedly see the towers of the Holy City on the horizon. The army was in good condition. The men's desire to press forward and take Jerusalem was almost physically palpable. Richard pulled back. His reasoning was sound and remains one of the most debated strategic decisions in medieval military history. Jerusalem is an inland city, miles from the coast, surrounded by difficult terrain with limited water. Taking the city by assault required a siege. A siege required supply lines. Supply lines in hostile territory were vulnerable to Saladin's mobile cavalry. And even if the city was taken, then what? The army would have fulfilled its crusading vows, and most of its members would go home. Richard understood that taking Jerusalem and holding Jerusalem were two different military problems. The second advance in the summer of 1192 again brought the army close. Again Richard pulled back, this time citing intelligence that Saladin had reinforced the city's defenses significantly and destroyed the wells along the approach routes. Outcome: Jerusalem was never taken during the Third Crusade. This fact, the Crusade's fundamental strategic failure, must be held in mind. For all of Richard's tactical brilliance, all of the army's courage, all of the logistical achievement, Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands. What you are about to see is a military engagement so remarkable that Saladin's own secretaries recorded it with something approaching awe. It is the story of a king who rode into battle with fewer than 80 knights against thousands of cavalry, and won. To understand the Battle of Jaffa, we need to understand how Richard found himself fighting it. The battle was not a planned engagement. It was a crisis response, a firefighting operation, an example of Richard's ability to improvise brilliantly under the worst possible circumstances. By the summer of 1192, the Third Crusade had reached a peculiar and exhausting stalemate. Richard had twice advanced toward Jerusalem and twice pulled back. He had negotiated, fought, campaigned, and maneuvered with extraordinary skill, but the fundamental strategic problem remained. The Crusader forces were not strong enough to take Jerusalem and hold it, and Richard's army, which had been in the field for more than a year, was deteriorating. Disease, desertion, and the natural attrition of a long campaign had reduced his effective fighting strength significantly. Compounding the military problem was a political catastrophe. In April 1192, Conrad of Montferrat was assassinated by members of the assassin sect. Conrad's death remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Crusade. The assassins claimed responsibility for this targeted killing, but who hired them? Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some blamed Saladin, others Richard or various Crusader factions. No definitive answer was established. Conrad died at the peak of his influence, recognized as the rightful king of Jerusalem. His death plunged the political settlement into chaos. His widow, Isabella, was quickly married to Count Henry of Champagne. Philip of France had already gone home in August 1191, citing illness. His departure removed a major asset. Philip had argued with Richard constantly and planned to exploit Richard's absence by moving against English territories in France. Richard was running out of time. His English barons urged his return, and his brother John was scheming in England. The political situation at home was deteriorating. He could not stay forever. Richard made a strategic decision. He would shift operations to the southern coast. Ascalon, demolished by Saladin, needed rebuilding. Richard moved his forces south, personally working alongside his men in the labor of rebuilding fortifications. But as Richard's forces were distributed, Saladin saw an opportunity. In late July 1192, Saladin marched on Jaffa. Jaffa was not heavily defended. Richard had left a small garrison, but the city was unprepared for a serious assault. When Saladin arrived with his full army and began bombardment, the garrison found themselves in desperate straits. Saladin's attack was calculated. He knew Richard was at Ascalon, his forces dispersed. If he could take Jaffa quickly, he would eliminate the Crusaders' main coastal base and force their withdrawal. One message reached Richard at Ascalon. Jaffa was about to fall. The garrison could not hold. Unless the king came immediately, the city and garrison would be lost. Richard's response was immediate. He did not wait to assemble his full army, nor for horses. There wasn't time. He gathered available men, boarded his ships, and sailed north through the night. By morning, August 1st, 1192, Saladin's forces had breached Jaffa's walls, fighting street by street. The garrison had fallen back to the citadel, making a last stand. From the sea, the situation looked hopeless. Walls were in Muslim hands, Saladin's banners flew, then a figure appeared on the walls, a priest or soldier who threw himself into the sea. The garrison still held the citadel. They had not surrendered. There was still time. Richard made his decision. The coast near Jaffa was too shallow for ships. Landing troops under fire required wading in. Richard's captains hesitated. The situation looked suicidal. But then, Richard jumped. The King of England waded through the surf onto the beach. His men, shamed and electrified, followed. Crossbowmen provided covering fire. Within minutes, the beach was covered with shouting Crusader soldiers. The sight of the king landing under fire galvanized the garrison. Reports reached them. The king has come. The fighting in Jaffa was vicious, close quarters, and confused. Richard's force was small. The Muslim forces, caught between the garrison and the new force from the sea, found themselves in an untenable position. Saladin, receiving reports of Richard's arrival, chose to withdraw, pulling his forces back from the city. By the end of August 1st, 1192, Richard had retaken Jaffa. The garrison was saved. The city was back in Crusader hands. Richard achieved this with a force numerically inferior to Saladin's army. It was a demonstration of boldness and tactical timing that his contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. But the crisis was not over. Saladin had withdrawn, but he had not gone away. His army, vastly superior in cavalry, was camped around Jaffa. Estimates vary, but Crusader sources consistently describe the Muslim force as enormous, ranging from 7,000 to 20,000 cavalry. Richard had what he brought by ship: approximately 54 knights, 15 mounted sergeants, and 2,000 crossbowmen and infantry. The obvious military advice was to stay behind Jaffa's walls. The city offered protection. Inside, Richard's crossbowmen could inflict tremendous casualties. Saladin would face a costly siege. Richard apparently considered this and rejected it. Or perhaps events made the choice for him. The morning of August 5th, 1192, dawned early and hot. Saladin had decided not to wait. At first light, before the camp was fully awake, Saladin's cavalry moved. What followed is one of the most intensely documented battle actions of the medieval period. Chronicled by Crusader writers, Muslim historians, and Saladin's secretary, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, with admiration. A sentry on the walls of Jaffa gave the alarm. Saladin's cavalry was advancing. A great sweeping mass of horsemen moved toward the city from multiple directions across the flat coastal plain. Richard was already in armor, his reaction to the alarm immediate: out of the gate, deploy, now. He took his absurdly small army out of the city and onto the beach, not deploying a defense behind walls. Let us appreciate the tactical logic of this decision, because it is not obvious. The beach constrained Saladin's cavalry on one flank. The sea and Richard's fleet provided an impassable left flank. Saladin could only attack from the front and the landward flank, making the frontage manageable for Richard's forces. This was Richard thinking in 3 dimensions, using geography to compensate for numerical inferiority. The formation was a combination of every lesson he had learned, adapted to his drastically reduced resources. Between the kneeling infantry at regular intervals were the crossbowmen, deployed in pairs. one man shooting, one reloading, creating a nearly continuous bolt fire along the formation. At the rear, Richard's handful of knights, 54 men, were shielded from the initial arrow storm. They were ready to exploit any gap, countercharge any breakthrough, or reinforce any threatened point. And out in front, visible to everyone, shouting orders and gesturing, was Richard himself. Saladin launched his first charge. The first wave of Saladin's cavalry, hundreds of horsemen, came across the beach at speed. They aimed to break the infantry line, which would mean the battle would be over in minutes. But the infantry held. The spears took the first horses, shields absorbed the impact. Crossbowmen fired at point-blank range, bolts punching through armor, horses screamed and fell. The wave broke against the infantry like water against a rock. The Muslim cavalry wheeled back. Saladin sent another wave. This was not a single charge, but repeated attacks again and again over hours. After each failed charge, there was a pause. The Muslim cavalry regrouped, crossbowmen reloaded. The infantry maintained their kneeling position. Saladin's commanders tried to identify weaknesses but couldn't find one. Part of what made the formation so difficult to break was its internal discipline. This kind of discipline is not natural human behavior. It is trained behavior, speaking to the quality of Richard's infantry and the trust the men had in their king's tactical dispositions. At some point, Richard rode along the entire length of the formation in front of it, between his infantry and the Muslim cavalry. The Muslim horsemen hesitated to charge directly at the lone rider, who was so obviously the king. A Muslim source says Saladin, watching, sent Richard 2 fresh horses as a gesture of chivalric respect. After several hours of defensive fighting, Richard decided it was time to stop absorbing and start delivering. His infantry line had held, his crossbowmen inflicted substantial casualties. The Muslim forces showed signs of organizational strain, their cohesion degrading. Richard gathered his knights, all 54 of them. The plan was simple: wait for a gap, then hit it. The next wave of Muslim cavalry came. The crossbowmen fired. The infantry line held. The cavalry broke and began to wheel back. Richard sounded the charge. 54 men against an army. The charge hit the regrouping Muslim cavalry at the worst possible moment. Richard himself was in the front rank, fighting with a lance, then his sword. The Muslim cavalry fell back, retreating rapidly from the charging knights. The momentum carried Richard's men through the first line of cavalry and into the open space beyond. What happened next is perhaps the single most famous individual feat of arms of the entire Third Crusade. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's secretary, describes a moment he found extraordinary. The King of England, separated somewhat from his small group of knights, fighting alone in the midst of the Muslim army. What the Muslim chroniclers describe is Richard moving through the fight on horseback, attacking everything within range, his sword arm working continuously. An observer notes that Richard's lance swept through the Muslim ranks from one side to the other, a hyperbolic expression of his physical dominance. He is described as almost supernaturally difficult to stop, a combination of physical size, superb training, excellent armor, and adrenaline. There is a story that at one point Richard rode through the Muslim lines entirely by himself, and that no one dared to attack him directly. Whether literally true or an exaggeration, it conveys something real about the psychological effect Richard had on opponents. He was known, his reputation was enormous. The sight of his heraldic device carried a weight of accumulated story and fear. 2 notable incidents during Richard's individual combats at Jaffa are recorded in enough detail to warrant specific attention. The first involves a Muslim emir, one of Saladin's capable officers. Richard reportedly rode at this man and unhorsed him in a single pass. The emir survived, but was taken prisoner or escaped. The Arabic sources found it worth recording that this particular man went down to Richard. The second, more famous, involves a direct challenge. A very senior Muslim officer attempted to engage Richard directly. The accounts are confusing, but all agree that Richard was not beaten, and whoever faced him directly regretted it. Richard's single combats were not merely adventurism or personal bravery, though he was unquestionably brave in a reckless way. They served a tactical purpose. Every time Richard engaged directly, he drew Muslim cavalry after him, surrounded by his bodyguard knights. What looked like individual heroism was also the most concentrated fighting unit, creating disruption and casualties far out of proportion to its numbers. For all of Richard's individual brilliance, for all of the infantry line's disciplined holding, the battle was not decided quickly or cleanly. The numbers remained what they were. Saladin had thousands of cavalry, and Richard had 54 knights. At mid-morning, after several hours of fighting, a section of the Crusader infantry line came under pressure so severe that it began to waver. Multiple chroniclers describe a moment when it appeared that the formation might break. The crisis was real. What Richard did at this moment is the kind of decision-making that elevates military talent to military genius. He did not freeze. He did not try to rally the section by riding back to it. That would take too long. He attacked. He turned his small group of knights and drove at the cavalry, threatening the wavering section, hitting them from an unexpected angle, with enough violence that they pulled back from the infantry line. The threatened section had time to close its gap. The line held. This moment illustrates the central tactical concept that made Richard's army so effective: aggressive defense. The defense was never passive. Every time Muslim cavalry tried to exploit a weakness, Richard created a more urgent problem for them somewhere else. He was constantly looking for the opportunity to hit back, harder, in a way that disrupted the enemy's decision cycle. By midday, the situation had shifted. Saladin's cavalry had now made multiple charges against the Crusader line, each defeated. The crossbow casualties among the Muslim forces were significant. Sustained fire had taken a toll on the cavalry. Horses hit by bolts were flagging. Men who had seen charge after charge break were beginning to lose aggressive conviction. Saladin reportedly asked his cavalry commanders why the charges were failing, and they told him the crossbowmen made it impossible to approach. The sustained, organized bolt fire from Richard's paired crossbowmen had created a zone that even the bravest cavalry found difficult to sustain. This was not luck. It was the deliberate tactical system that Richard had deployed. As the afternoon heat rose and Saladin's cavalry faltered, Richard sensed the moment. He had been husbanding his resources all morning. Now, with Saladin's forces tired, spread, and psychologically shaken, he committed. He ordered a general advance. It is important to understand what general advance means with a force this small. Richard was not unleashing an overwhelming counterattack. He was advancing a force of 2,000 infantry and 54 knights against an army that still had several thousand cavalry available. It was audacious. And it worked. The Muslim cavalry did not break in a single catastrophic moment. It was more gradual. A retreat that began at the edges and slowly communicated itself to the center. But retreat it was. Saladin's army withdrew from the field. By mid-afternoon of August 5, 1192, the Battle of Jaffa was over. Richard's force had held Jaffa against an assault by thousands. They had done it in the open, not behind walls, through discipline, tactical intelligence, and the extraordinary personal combat leadership of the king. Saladin did not attempt another assault on Jaffa. The Battle of Jaffa had immediate and profound effects on both sides. For Saladin, the defeat was psychologically significant. He had attacked with overwhelming cavalry superiority and had been stopped. His secretary's account has a quality of bemused wonder, trying to explain how this could have happened. The answer, from Saladin's perspective, was Richard. The man was simply not playing by normal rules. A medieval king was not supposed to wade into the sea under fire. He was not supposed to lead cavalry charges personally with 54 knights. He was not supposed to ride alone through the middle of the enemy army. He was not supposed to win. For Richard, the victory at Jaffa was confirmation of a strategic reality. His army could defend positions against Saladin's cavalry, but it was also a demonstration of the fundamental limit of his campaign. He had won a brilliant defensive victory with 2,000 men and 54 knights. To take Jerusalem, he needed a much larger force, maintain supply lines, and conduct a siege, all of which required resources he didn't have. Richard chose repeatedly to fight on the defensive, relying on discipline and firepower rather than making aggressive advances on Jerusalem. Do you think this was the right strategy? Could he have taken Jerusalem if he'd been more aggressive? Tell us in the comments. The Third Crusade was shaped by a series of critical turning points, moments where the course of events could have gone differently. A different decision or a different death would have produced a different campaign, perhaps a different world. Let us examine the most significant of these. Frederick Barbarossa was not just the largest contributor to the Third Crusade in terms of manpower. He was also the most experienced military commander in Europe, fighting campaigns for 40 years, managing fractious coalitions before. Had Frederick lived and arrived at Acre with even a reduced version of his army, the Third Crusade would have been fundamentally different. The combined force of the English, French, and German armies, under three of the most powerful rulers, would have been capable of more. Most critically, the two aborted advances on Jerusalem might not have been aborted. Frederick's death in the Salif River on June 10, 1190, was not a military defeat. It was an accident, the random intervention of a current, a misjudged ford, a moment of bad luck. And it may have been the single most consequential event of the entire crusade. When Philip Augustus of France departed the Holy Land in August 1191, he took with him not only manpower, but also an agreement. Many of Philip's vassals had agreed to stay for another 40 days after the fall of Acre. After that, they were free to leave. Some stayed, many left. The French departure significantly reduced Richard's available manpower for the subsequent campaign. But Philip's departure had a second, less direct effect that was perhaps more damaging. Philip went straight to France. He immediately began planning to exploit Richard's absence. He approached Richard's brother John. He was working to destabilize the Angevin Empire from within. This created constant pressure on Richard from home. A draining strategic distraction, an awareness that every week he spent in the Holy Land was another week in which his kingdom was being undermined. Philip's departure was motivated by genuine illness, political calculation, and personal dislike of Richard. It was disastrous for the Crusade's success. Conrad of Montferrat was, by almost any measure, the most capable political and military leader available to the Crusaders after Richard himself. He had saved Tyre from Saladin in 1187, when virtually everything else had fallen. He had just been recognized as the rightful king of Jerusalem. The dispute with Guy of Lusignan was finally resolved. 2 days later, he was dead. The political vacuum that his death created was filled hurriedly and imperfectly by Henry of Champagne. Henry was capable and well-liked, but he was a newcomer without Conrad's experience, relationships, or roots in the Holy Land. He could not replace what Conrad represented. Had Conrad lived, he might have been able to manage the aftermath of the Third Crusade. His death at this precise moment, just as the political situation was beginning to stabilize, was a blow from which the Crusader cause never fully recovered. Both of Richard's decisions to retreat from within striking distance of Jerusalem deserve treatment as turning points. Each was the moment when the Crusade's fundamental objectives slipped out of reach. The first retreat, in January 1192, came when the army had advanced to Beit Nuba, 12 miles from Jerusalem. Richard's council, including French barons, Templars, Hospitallers, and local nobility, voted on whether to continue the advance. The vote was against advancing, and it was the Crusaders from the Holy Land themselves who voted most strongly against. Their argument was sophisticated. Taking Jerusalem was not enough. Jerusalem was surrounded by hostile territory. Without the ability to supply the city and hold it against Saladin's inevitable counterattack, any occupation would be temporary and catastrophically costly. Richard agreed with this analysis. But the retreat cost the Crusade its momentum, its purpose, and a significant portion of its morale. The second retreat in July 1192 was even more painful because it came after all of the work of Jaffa and the coastal campaign. Getting within sight of the city a second time and turning away a second time was a wound that bled into the peace negotiations that followed. After Jaffa, after the second retreat from Jerusalem, after months of negotiation through intermediaries, Richard and Saladin reached an agreement. The Treaty of Jaffa, concluded in September 1192, established terms that were simultaneously a remarkable diplomatic achievement and an acknowledgement of what had not been accomplished. The terms: a 3-year truce. The coast from Acre to Jaffa would remain in Crusader hands. Jerusalem would remain under Saladin's control. Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem peacefully and would not be harassed. The fortifications that Richard had been building at Ascalon, a contentious point, would be demolished. Richard never personally signed the treaty. He was ill again. The recurring fever that had plagued him had returned with severity. He reportedly wept when the final terms were confirmed, because they meant leaving without Jerusalem. The city he had come to reconquer, that he had spent years and a fortune preparing to fight for, remained in Muslim hands. He never returned to the Holy Land. He left in October 1192 and would spend the next year as a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor. A medieval army on campaign consumed staggering quantities of food and fodder. A rough estimate for 10,000 men, 10 tons of food per day. Plus, perhaps 3 to 4 times that in fodder for the horses. Horses were a particular problem. A war horse needed up to 20 pounds of grain per day, plus grass or hay. An army of 5,000 horses needed 100,000 pounds of fodder daily. The logistics of feeding an army in a hostile country, where the local population was largely evacuated or actively hostile, was a genuine strategic constraint. The land route armies, Frederick's Germans, and the earlier Crusaders, attempted to solve this problem through foraging. This worked when the countryside was productive and the local population was cooperative or too weak to resist. It failed when Saladin employed his scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, filling wells, and driving livestock away before the Crusader advance. Richard's solution, the fleet, the controlled coastal march, the supply chain from Cyprus, was fundamentally different. He did not rely on foraging. He relied on pre-positioned supply, transported by sea from a secured rear base. Cyprus served as the logistics hub. Food, replacement horses, spare weapons and armor, medical supplies, and fresh troops all flowed from Cyprus. Saladin was no less sophisticated in his understanding of logistics. His cavalry tactics could not stop Richard's coastal march. He turned to a strategic tool: deny them the resources they needed without a pitched battle. Saladin's scorched earth policy had several components. His forces destroyed crops and filled wells with debris. They drove livestock away and demolished fortifications rather than leaving them as Crusader bases. The city of Ascalon, Richard's desired southern base, was razed to its foundations. Saladin made this decision with reluctance, as Ascalon was beautiful, but it was militarily sound. Ascalon's destruction was a turning point. It forced Richard to spend months rebuilding it rather than advancing. Those months meant the army wasn't marching on Jerusalem. Men fell ill, morale ebbed, and the political situation deteriorated. The more aggressive manifestation of Saladin's logistics strategy was the attack on Jerusalem's water supply. Before Richard's second advance, Saladin ensured water sources along the route were contaminated or destroyed. Without water, a besieging army in the summer heat of Judea would not survive long enough to prosecute a siege. This was one of the decisive factors in Richard's second retreat. Not timidity, but the fundamental requirement to drink. The immediate outcome of the Third Crusade is both impressive and deeply disappointing, depending on what you were expecting. The coastal strip, from Acre south to Jaffa, was secured. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was restored as a viable political entity. Acre would serve as the capital of this reduced kingdom and would remain a Crusader city for another century. The right of Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem was established by treaty. This was not nothing. For thousands whose motivation was devotional, the ability to walk the Via Dolorosa was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Within weeks of the treaty's conclusion, Christian pilgrims were walking into Jerusalem under Saladin's protection. Richard himself did not go. He was offered safe conduct by Saladin to visit the city he had spent 3 years trying to capture. He refused. His stated reason was that he could not come to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. He would come as a conqueror, or not at all. Whether you find this noble or stubborn probably depends on your temperament. It is certainly revealing about Richard's character. For the Crusader states, the Third Crusade provided a temporary reprieve and a structural reconfiguration. The coastally focused Kingdom of Jerusalem was more defensible than the inland-focused kingdom that had existed before Hattin. It lasted a century. The final Crusader strongholds fell in 1291 when the Mamluks took Acre. For Islam, the Third Crusade confirmed and consolidated the prestige of Saladin. His successful defense of Jerusalem became the foundational story of Islamic resistance to the Crusades. Saladin became a legendary figure, celebrated as a military commander and a model of justice, piety, and dignified rulership. His legacy endures into the present day, invoked as an image of Arab or Islamic unity against external aggression. For Europe, the Third Crusade's failure to retake Jerusalem had a slow but significant effect on the moral and theological framework. Three powerful kings, the greatest army since antiquity, yet Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The theological confidence of the crusading ideology began, slowly, to crack. The movement became more complex, politically motivated, and less capable of mobilizing mass popular enthusiasm. Saladin did not long outlast the Third Crusade. He died in Damascus on March 4, 1193. He was approximately 55 years old. When his treasurer assessed his estate, the most powerful ruler had less than 40 dirhams. He had given everything away, to his soldiers, to the poor, in alms, in gifts. After his death, the Ayyubid empire he had created began almost immediately to fragment. His sons and brothers began fighting over the inheritance. The unity Saladin had forged dissolved. Within a generation, the Ayyubid dynasty would be replaced by the Mamluks, former military slaves. They proved to be the most effective anti-Crusader force of the medieval period. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192. His departure was disguised. He was captured near Vienna in December 1192, identified despite his disguise, and handed over to Henry VI. He spent 14 months as a prisoner in various imperial castles, most notably Dürnstein, on the Danube. The ransom demanded, 150,000 marks, was paid, with enormous difficulty and strain on the English economy. The legend of Richard's imprisonment and rescue by his minstrel Blondel is almost certainly fictional. But like many medieval legends, it captures something emotionally real: the king's isolation, the loyalty of his followers. Richard returned to England in March 1194. He had one brief, efficient campaign to reclaim castles. Then he spent the remaining 5 years of his reign fighting Philip of France for control of his French territories. He was killed in 1199 by a crossbow bolt during a siege in the Limousin region of France. He was 41 years old. The question haunts the Third Crusade. Twice Richard's army stood within a day's march of Jerusalem. Twice it turned around. Was this the correct decision? Could Jerusalem have been taken? The case for pressing the advance. Richard's army, in the summer of 1192, was probably in its best condition. Saladin's forces, while formidable, had been repeatedly unable to stop the Crusader army in pitched battle. An assault on Jerusalem's walls, which were strong but not impregnable, might have succeeded. Jerusalem is surrounded by terrain very different from the coastal plain where Richard had been winning. The road from Beit Nuba crosses broken, hilly ground with limited water. A besieging army would face serious difficulty. Saladin had destroyed the wells. Even a successful siege would be followed by his counterattack. The city would be isolated, surrounded by hostile territory, with a supply line stretching back to Jaffa and Cyprus. Experienced soldiers, Templars, Hospitallers, and local barons consistently voted against advancing on Jerusalem. These men understood what it meant to hold an inland city against Saladin's cavalry. Their votes carry real weight. Most historians conclude Jerusalem could not have been taken and held with Richard's forces in 1192. A Jerusalem taken and then immediately lost would have been worse, psychologically and strategically, than not taken at all. There is a paradox at the heart of Richard's Third Crusade. He was the finest military commander of his age. His tactical achievements, the coastal march, Arsuf, the defense and recapture of Jaffa, were extraordinary. But the crusade failed to achieve its fundamental objective, the permanent securing of Jerusalem. Part of the answer lies in limited resources. Richard's England was wealthy, but not infinite. Political situations at home, Philip's scheming and John's disloyalty, imposed a real-time limit on his stay. Reinforcements promised from Europe materialized slowly and inadequately, further hindering his efforts. The Crusade was a political coalition of fractious competing interests, not just a military project. Disputes between Guy and Conrad, and rivalries among orders, consumed energy that could have gone into the campaign. Saladin's strategic reality was another factor. The destruction of Jerusalem's military at Hattin was complete. The reconquest of the coast and supply infrastructure was costly. Richard didn't have enough left to succeed. Richard was brilliant, perhaps the best tactical commander. But brilliance cannot compensate for strategic inadequacy. History gave Richard and Saladin extraordinary opponents in each other. Their conflict transcended ordinary warfare. Richard the Lionheart became the archetype of the warrior king. Brave, skilled, formidable, inspiring. The historical Richard was more complicated, brilliant and brutal, generous and capable of massacre. He was a better general than a king. His administrative record was undistinguished. His subjects suffered from the financial drain of his crusade and his ransom. He was human, more interesting than legend. Saladin, too, was more complicated than his legend. The chivalric, just, generous Saladin was real. But he was also a ruthless political operator who eliminated rivals and executed enemies. He conducted warfare with full medieval violence, a great man in the fullest, most morally complex sense. The extraordinary thing is they genuinely respected each other, not as a formal gesture, but personally. Exchanges of gifts, Saladin sending Richard fresh horses, Richard sending medical supplies, speak to this. They never met. That is one of history's great missed encounters. In negotiations, they communicated through envoys. The face-to-face meeting never happened. We are left to imagine Richard's impatience, Saladin's calm, and two great minds in the same room. The Third Crusade ended in September 1192, with a treaty both sides accepted, yet neither entirely. Arguments about Jerusalem, who has the right, who controls it, are still happening today. The walls of Acre, rebuilt by Crusaders and taken by Mamluks, still stand. You can walk them. The underground city beneath modern Acre, the tunnels and halls of the Crusader city, can be visited. The stones that Richard's engineers placed are still there, a tangible link to the past. The horns of Hattin are still there, bare volcanic rock above a dry plateau. The road along Israel's coast, modern Route 2, follows Richard's army's path in August 1191. The plain where Richard deployed his formation at Jaffa is now the beachfront of a Mediterranean city. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The rhymes in this story still echo. Faith versus faith, west versus east. Military brilliance versus political failure. What armies achieve versus what societies sustain. The Third Crusade is exceptionally well documented, with sources from both sides, which is unusual. On the Crusader side, the Itinerarium Peregrinorum and Histoire de la Guerre Sainte are important. Roger of Hoveden Chronica and Richard of Devise's Chronicle provide English perspectives. On the Islamic side, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's personal secretary, wrote two major works. These provide detailed and vivid accounts from the Muslim perspective. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad wrote a biography of Saladin, a primary source and admirable medieval work. Ibn al-Athir's great universal chronicle provides broader context. All of these sources have biases, writing with an agenda to celebrate leaders or justify decisions. The historian's task is to read them critically, compare them, and triangulate toward the truth. What we can say with confidence, the Third Crusade was real, battles fought as described, and the two men at its center were extraordinary human beings who shaped events. They influenced history on a scale few individuals in any century have equaled. What do we take from all of this? After the marching and the dying, the strategic brilliance and tactical horror, the generosity and the massacre, the negotiation and the broken trust? Perhaps this: the gap between winning battles and achieving lasting peace is an old problem. Richard won brilliant, textbook battles that military theorists still analyze. Yet he went home without the city he came to take. Saladin, for all his political genius and military skill, managed a truce with enemies. He held together an empire that would begin to fall apart the day he died. Neither man got what he came for. Richard wanted Jerusalem. Saladin wanted the Crusaders gone permanently. Both were disappointed. The nameless soldier fighting on the beach at Jaffa, he survived. He went home eventually, if disease or battle didn't take him. He saw things no man in his village had seen or would see. He fought in one of history's most famous military campaigns. Perhaps he never talked about it much, or constantly at the alehouse, boring his grandchildren with tales of heat, dust, horses, and the king on the beach. He was there. That matters. History is not made only by kings and generals. It is made by the ordinary, frightened, brave, hungry, exhausted people, those who carry out orders or refuse them, and who carry the weight of what they've seen. The Third Crusade ended in a treaty. The questions it raised are still open. The city it fought over still stands, still contested, sacred, beautiful, still breaking hearts of everyone who loves it and cannot agree on how to share it. 830 years later, we are still, in some sense, in the world that Saladin and Richard made. If you've made it this far, through the courts of Jerusalem and the camps at Acre, through the coastal march and the charges at Arsuf, the political machinations and diplomacy, through the violence of Jaffa and the quiet tragedy of the retreats, you deserve acknowledgement. You have spent real time, your most valuable asset, trying to understand something from 8 centuries ago, trying to understand people from a different world, yet who were, in all ways that matter, exactly like us. Afraid and brave, selfish and generous, brilliant and foolish, capable of extraordinary love and cruelty. That act of understanding, seeing across centuries, recognizing humanity, is not a small thing. It is, I would argue, one of the most important things we can do. So to you, wherever you are watching from, whatever brought you here, thank you. Thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for your patience with the complexity. Thank you for caring about the past. History is not a collection of dead facts. It is the ongoing story of our species, still being written, still being argued about, still mattering. Every time someone tries to understand what really happened, they are doing something quietly heroic. Refusing to let the past disappear into silence. We will see you in the next one. Cheers.